All right. Hello, everyone. It's November the 28th, 2025. The last video I recorded, I was talking about the transit of Venus in the third decan of Scorpio, which will be ingressing into Sagittarius shortly. But before that happens, it's in there with Mercury, which is also stationing direct. And I tried to talk about these two planets, the transits they're doing in respect to all the other aspects, this grand water trine and all this. I basically neglected to get into the fact that Venus is also opposing Uranus, and Uranus is in Taurus in retrograde. And it's an interesting transit for me for another number of reasons. And I think that maybe in some way it's a kind of a serendipity that my last video I kind of left out the Uranus thing. Although I had this idea to talk about a song that I liked from Twin Peaks: The Return, where this girl Lizzie is performing, and there's something about it that is maybe a bit like it's about the wild, wild west. So there's a certain kind of, when you think about the wild west, you think about freedom. We think about, or like playing in sort of rough bars. You think about a kind of rebelliousness or something like that. And I think there's that Uranus influence, especially in Taurus. There's a certain sort of cowboy country sort of quality maybe with Taurus. There's some kind of thing in there that I was trying to hit upon. And to be fair, I also was not overly happy with that video. I ended up trying to edit it a bit, because my sometimes I've better performance with my oratory abilities than others. Okay, I didn't think I was on my best game last time I tried recording a video. Um, in light of recent events, there's been a whole bunch of things happening, and I thought that it would be time to focus more specifically on the Uranus in Taurus, um, because Taurus is an Earth sign. There is a focus compared to, like, say, the next sign, Gemini, where Uranus is going to be spending a good like 7 years in Gemini in air signs and making these trines to Pluto and Aquarius, a lot of air. We have this moment where Uranus is back in Taurus, activating an Earth sign where there is an increased focus on material resources. And in the recent news, there was just announced. It was also kind of interesting because this goes with the Mercury retrograde as well, maybe, because Mercury is about making deals and planning and organizing and all this kind of stuff. That there's just been announced plans for a pipeline in the West Coast, and I have to admit that this is not something that I have difficulty taking this neutrally, but I have to also admit that I did vote for Mark Carney, and I kind of realized that this could be part of a problem, but we're not given much. I mean, there's this other kind of thing going on here where when it comes to politics and doing astrology, that some astrologers on YouTube have taken the strategy of being very unpolitical or shying away from politics. And I, in some way, can sympathize with them, but there's something about where if I were to try to approach this with leaving all the politics out of it, it just feels off to me, right? And so for me, I'm trying to find the right compromise or the right balance between that. And when it comes to this transit right now of Venus in Scorpio opposing Uranus and Taurus, and the significations of these resource-based politics, key turning points happening. I live in British Columbia, and our Premier David Eby was saying that he was disappointed that while they're pushing through this pipeline, they lost a deal with this company Nutrien that is an exporter of potash, and they wanted to be like having transportation of potash from Saskatchewan all the way. I mean, Saskatchewan is quite a far away to a port in Vancouver to ship potash for fertilizer or whatever. And there's also some concerning things too about how there's an LNG project that is apparently, even like this is basically the issue, is that in the midst of the ongoing political tensions and all this kind of stuff, there is stress put on the Canadian economy by which our Prime Minister, who I voted for, by the way, Mark Carney, has come up with this grandiose scheme to build baby build as a alternative to the drill baby drill thing, that he's going to build a number of different projects that will bring economic wealth and prosperity for Canada for generations to come. And as a Canadian citizen, I have to admit that for a long time I've been just living in the suburbs, which is a slightly more conservative kind of area. But during the times when I lived in urban areas, there's more of a concentration of, let's say, politically, I don't know if radical is necessarily the right word, but there were types who were active. One of the things that it seems to be a consensus is that amongst politically active British Columbians is that they really don't like pipelines. And there's a certain, what's also interesting is that even if there might be a lot of people who are pushed further to what would be considered the right wing, that some of these people, you may have unexpected bedfellows that are a bunch of right wingers who are unexpectedly environmentalist in a way that doesn't quite make sense. It doesn't quite add up, because the same people would be very like pro capitalism, pro big business, pro all sorts of stuff. But then when it comes to environmentalism, they really want to keep the environment nice, and they want to protect our land from being turned into big factories or parking lots, or so it's kind of like, well, hold on, like. So this is kind of there's an opportunity, and there's some kind of issue too where I think there's a certain, like, the way that the hippies have been pushed towards the right wing. I have firsthand experience of this. I was there, ground zero, basically, in the trenches with my whatever hippie roommates that I had to deal with. I have firsthand experience dealing with the West Coast hippies and all their idiosyncrasies and all this kind of stuff. And it's from this position that there's one of the reasons why I make the choice to do an astrology channel rather than a a politics channel or something like that, is because as a progressive, left-wing oriented person, you have to have a tough skin, and you have to be able to deal with constant disappointments, constant defeats, constant problems. And meanwhile, is if you were to be, like, let's say, a conservative, like you were on the other side of the coin, you wanted to be like a political pundit for the right wing, you could be basically any little minor bit of success, and some billionaire is going to be like emptying his wallet out for you to set you up as like a podcaster, and like to amplify your algorithm with like artificial bot counts and all this. Like, there's this whole army of wealth behind. The wind is at your sails if you want to be a right wing pundit. But if you're a leftist, you have to have a tough skin. You have to just put up with constant defeats and all this kind of stuff. You have to compromise and vote for liberals who basically are conservatives in disguise. It's kind of annoying. And for this reason, at least astrology sort of gives me joy. It's something that I can just sort of like enjoy doing. But it's not. I don't know if I have the constitution just to put myself through the grinder of a purely, emancipatory, progressive political project or whatever, right? But in this, but I think there's something about the Uranus. Why am I talking about this for Uranus? Because Uranus is interesting because Uranus is a planet that marks the first of the modern outer planets that were discovered at the time of the French and American Revolution, at the turning point where they had the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution as well. And so Uranus is a particularly interesting archetype because in astrology, it represents all these kinds of things about inventiveness, about rebellion from the status quo, about the search for emancipation and freedom. All of these kinds of things are inherent possibilities in the planet Uranus. And there's some issue here when you think about it, because if Uranus is technology and inventions and change and all this kind of stuff, then there was obviously huge changes that happened with the Industrial Revolution, with the invention of new technologies, with the even things about like the disruption of the old hierarchies of the monarchy and the introduction of democracy and these kinds of new Enlightenment age principles, right? This is all real Uranus stuff, and I think that there's some in the current political climate. There's something that interests me is the recent controversies where it's one thing for Donald Trump to target the Black Bloc or the Antifa or whatever you would say as a terrorist organization, right? But it's another thing, I think, to consider like anti-capitalists, people who would be against capitalism, to be a similar kind of a dangerous threat or something like that to be defended against. Or because there's something about this that's kind of confusing, like that kind of move that Donald Trump recently made. And I think that it reminds me that when it comes to the dialogue that's happening in progressive circles, it's not necessarily even clear whether or not we all agree that capitalism is even a problem, right? But to say that people, if you were going to make a move and signal that everybody who has positioned themselves as anti-capitalists are a dangerous threat, then you're sort of taking for granted a number of things that may not even be like, and you're also saying that even to examine whether these things that you're taking for granted are true or false or what's going on there, even have a conversation about it, is itself a dangerous threat. Even there's a certain kind of, you have this kind of controlling over what you're allowed to talk about, what kind of ideas you're allowed to explore, what you're not allowed to explore, or at least attempt to do this, which is itself perhaps an admission that they don't actually have this control in the first place. It just kind of bothers them that they don't have that control, that we have a principle of free speech where you are actually allowed to talk about these things, and that there's some kind of like frustration of the old order that we're in a new era where people can talk about these things, and yet we're not. We have the impotency of these sort of mad kings who want to strangle the voice of the people or something like that into submission, right? In respect to this, the other night I was flipping on the Canopy app, which is a free streaming app brought to you by, if you have a public library card, you can access Canopy for free, right? And I was searching through the documentary section, and I came upon a documentary on capitalism by a guy whose name I recognized, Thomas Piketty, I think his name is, because I have a sort of interest in listening to people talk about economics, and I have to warn you that perhaps yesterday, the last video I did, I was trying to talk about like Twin Peaks and going wild in the wild wild west, and I kind of like not getting. This is going to be more dry because I'm trying to talk about economics, and a lot of people might just find economics to be boring, right? But what I thought this was an interesting movie to watch because it put an emphasis on something on a different place than usual, right? When I think about capitalism, what I tend to emphasize in my mind is the process of speculation, the process of lending, the process of credit. Basically, if you look at what marks the beginning of capitalism as I cognize it, as I have it in my mind, the dawn of the colonial trade, particularly the Dutch East India Trading Company, or the basic idea that you had this trade route that went from Britain and the Netherlands, that they would follow this trade route to East India, where they would get things like tea and spices and stuff like that, and then bring that back to Britain to sell at there was basically a leveraging point between the wealth of the British and the comparative poverty of the Indians, by which you could take a commodity that in the context of a certain market held a certain value and then sell it in another market for at a much greater price, to which you would make a massive profit. And that by the fact that you had the ability to speculate that you could make a return on your profit, you could get people to forward you a bunch of money so that you could have the money to buy a bunch of tea in the first place, to then bring it back and then sell at a higher profit. And of course, the thing is, it's never a surefire deal, because there could always be like what happens if your ship has a shipwreck and sinks, or what happens if you have a mutiny, or what happens if the tea has a bad crop that year, you don't have as much to buy as you thought. There's all sorts of things that could go wrong. So they have to admit that the people that are lending the money are basically taking on a bit of risk, and they are getting a bit of payoff for accepting those risks or whatever. So it's not like, but that's basically how I think about capitalism. But the thing is that in this Thomas Piketty movie, there are focusing on something kind of underlying that, is that in order for all this to happen, you need to have basically wealth to begin with in the first place. And wealth, primarily as they're defining it, is in the terms of assets, right? Assets as in either resources, land, all this kind of stuff. And it's basically the whole idea is like, if you were to look at that thing where you're making a loan, you're going to loan, somebody's going to say, I'm going to go to some country, buy a bunch of this commodity that we can sell and make lots of money off of. If you loan me a whole bunch of money to forward this, in order to make this system work, if the whole thing turned out to be a disaster and you were left on the hook for all this money that you didn't get the return on that you were expecting, then you have assets to back this up, right? And the whole thing about capitalism, do you guys remember this movie called Jumanji? Well, as a British Columbian, Jumanji was filmed in BC in a shopping mall that I remember. I actually went to that shopping mall in Jumanji as a child, and I remember there was a big store called Liquidation World, and it was basically the stuff that you'd find in Liquidation World was what you'd find in like a dollar store. A lot of cheap stuff, basically stuff from stores that wasn't selling. That basically what happens in retail is that if you have a bunch of consumer commodities that aren't selling, you have to clear them out, or else it's just like stock sitting on the shelf, not moving. And so if you're not, if you're, it doesn't look like you're making any money off of this, the whole thing is basically just, you're just taking a hit. So you basically liquidate a whole bunch of stuff, and then people basically, if you can make any money off it at all, you just sell it for dirt cheap. And there's this kind of problem about capitalism is basically there's these two. The thing is, if people talk about capitalism as if capitalism itself is profit, growth, accumulation, and you were to say, if you were to make this association in your head that the principle of growth, profit, and accumulation is itself inherently the principle of capitalism, and to say that you are anti-capital is to say you are anti-making money, anti-growing, anti-profiting, anti-success, anti-doing well, it then quickly starts to sound like you are against the goodness of life itself. You don't want anybody to be happy. You don't want anybody to do well. You don't want anybody to succeed. You're just a bitter, cynical jackass, right? The thing is, what I would like to clarify about with you about this is that capitalism itself isn't just about growth, profit, all this kind of stuff. It's about this, that you've created an excess of bullshit that nobody wants, and the only thing left to do is to liquidate the assets. You had this business venture that you thought you were going to make all this money off of, and now it didn't work, and now you are in the hole and you have a debt, and that you basically have, this is basically the other side of capitalism, is the liquidation of assets, basically, right? And the whole problem about this is that if you see capitalism as entirely all about growth, it's like saying that it would be like saying that breathing is all about inhaling and you forget about exhaling. You're like, oh, if you exhale, that's capitalism is a process that has like an in and an out motion, and that it eats you have as a basis, you have assets and wealth as a basis, a pile for which this thing called capitalism to grow off of, right? And what this thing does is that you have your assets and you have your wealth, and then you see another country that has assets and wealth, and you say, how do we go in, extract the assets and wealth from another country, sell it in such a way that we end up getting more profit and accumulating our assets, and that we keep doing this to a point where we keep pushing it to the point where we have to liquidate all our assets, right? If we really fuck up, right? And the whole point about capitalism is that there's no real point where you're like, oh, we've had enough, we've grown enough, we have to just keep growing and growing and growing and growing until we push it, and then it breaks, and then there's a crash, right? Like, lion don't just go up straight forever. There's going to be so we have this whole problem where there is people are under, capitalism isn't just about growth. Capitalism is about this underlying pressure to downsize and to liquidate assets. But this whole thing, like when that part of capitalism happens, where it's about downsizing and liquidizing assets, they try to present it in such a way that it's about making things more efficient. Right? We have all this excess, we have all these inefficiencies, and so by liquidating all our assets, we're just going to make things more efficient, right? And sure, I'm going to give you another example, is that where I live, the public transit company, if you want to look up a bus schedule, they used to have their own website that you could look up, and you could consider that having your own website, having your own scheduling service is like an asset, right? But we've gone through this process where there's been a liquidation of assets, and now if you go to look up your bus schedule, it redirects you to Google, and Google takes care of the bus assets for you. So now that our own publicly funded metro service is dependent on a multi-conglomerate international corporation to do the scheduling for you, and then meanwhile, they are a data company, so that they can see, so that for them they're like, oh well, for us it's in our financial interest to do this, because we can use this to harvest all kinds of data about where people ride their buses, and then we can be like, oh, if this person rides their bus route over here, then we can target them with ads, or we can sell all this information about where people are moving around to some other company, and then it's mixed in with all this other, you can see where this is going, right? And so that if you had your own scheduling system as your own asset, you could also be like, hey, you know what? Our own data, the privacy of where we go, we don't have to sell this to some creepy fucking multinational corporation that's not even democratically accountable to what they do with our data. We could actually keep that data as our own asset, as to be like, wow, guys, we have our own data. We don't have some fucking weird company exploiting our data for profit. We have our own data, and we have that as our asset that we can keep to ourselves, rather than turning ourselves over to, like, we are Indian people making tea, and our data is like a product that's harvested off of us, right, in the data economy. But so now instead of like us taking a bus just being about us having like the service of the user trying to get from point A to point B, this is also the digital exhaust of everything that we do creates information, which feeds an information economy, which is essentially in order to do this, now you need to create these big AI data centers. And to do what exactly? Is this going to make any of our lives better? Or is this going to be a process of extraction of value, in the same way that you had, like, maybe if you think about the liquidation of assets, the liquidation of resources, the fact that it tends, in my memory, it was basically like going to a big dollar store where you have a bunch of consumer products that aren't selling because the process of this value extraction is basically, you make more profit off of it the more that you can cut costs and make this a cheap thing that you give to people. And so it ends up being this thing where over time the stuff gets cheaper and cheaper and shittier and nobody wants it, right? And then it's like, so the value of what makes the product good is being extracted, and some person is hoarding it as like, we're going to give you something really shitty so that we can hoard all the wealth ourselves and call that a fair deal. It's not, okay? There's also this kind of problem so if you look at the way this is going, we have as a Canadians, we are lucky because Canada is a country that has very small population compared to its geography. And so the amount of people in Canada versus the amount of wealth that we have in the form of resources that are basically because the people who live in Canada are the citizens of the land, that we take our country, its geography, it's the whatever strategic advantage the geography gives us, whatever strategic advantage the resources this geography affords us, are all assets of the country by which we have the opportunity to make business deals and trade the wealth that we take to be ours with other countries and all this kind of stuff. But there's certain political tensions around all of this, of course, because the indigenous people are considered to be, like, who actually has a right to the land, who actually has a right to the resources on the land. And to the extent that, like, if you are a multinational mining corporation, more often than not, most of the mining that's done is not done by a nationalized industry, where it's done by a multinational company, and that more and more often the profits of these industries are not going back to the people, but rather to some offshore account in the Panama and Bermuda, all this kind of stuff, the Panama Papers. So it's like and it should be relatively simple to understand that this is a bad deal. This sucks, right? And I don't know what am I trying to say. I grew up in British Columbia, and I have a lot of exposure to either hippies or more what I would say environmentalists or politically radical types. And I had to. It's sort of, what can I say? It's like I knew a guy who was really into protesting the what was it? The Site C Dam, right? And the whole point of this is that we built a new hydroelectric dam that is basically far beyond whatever. If you just look at British Columbia, like I said, Canada doesn't have a lot of people. I guess it does help for when in one way, it's kind of like a give or take, because the controversy basically is to create a dam, you have to flood a certain area of land. And there was a lot of people who got dislocated by the flooding of this. I think this is a good Uranus thing, right? Because there is a positive thing about this, where when it comes to, let's say, the Canadian steel industry, because we've built these massive hydroelectric dams, that we can use hydroelectric power to power our steel industry. And that if you compare this to other countries where they're powering their steel industry with coal or something, this is a lot more environmentally friendly. And that when you have these climate protocols to target this to meet, people that are trying to work towards industries that are more green or something like that, they're going to like incentivize more environmentally friendly forms of producing steel over ones that are dependent on coal. So you get a plus with that. You get a negative with the fact that in order to do hydroelectric power, you have to flood a bunch of land that could be used for agriculture, and then that could perhaps put you more dependent on foreign countries for food, right? But the problem about this is that now that we have this era of like trade war and like all this hyper nationalized politics, is that we've built all this. We have a surplus of energy. Part of the planning of this was that we sell energy to our neighbors in the States, and now they don't want to buy our energy because they want to do it all nationalized, right? And the best they can come up with is to threaten to annex us. That would just solve the problem, because we don't have to worry about the national boundary, right? And so this is kind of like, but meanwhile, it's like we don't want to be annexed. Because, well, for one thing, from the point of view of British Columbians, we are way, 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 way more left-wing and way, 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 way more environmentalist than any of the Americans are. And it's just, it suits us. I mean, maybe with Alberta, maybe these guys identify more with Texas and the oil barons or something like that. But this is basically, we've just had in Canada the approval of a pipeline from Alberta going through, and that I know the kinds of people that, you could put all years and years and years and years of time into protesting these projects only to see them get pushed through, and then to be like, there are some pros and cons, but I mean, this is the kind of thing, is like, what am I going to do with my free time? If you put it towards politics, if you put it towards, I see all these people, bleeding heart, die hard political types, and all you have to put up with is basically time invested in resisting these projects that are getting put through, that are going through anyways, and like loss after loss after loss, and we get cynical about it, right? And then when you combine that attitude where we're resisting, our resistance isn't working, and then all the people that are, we have this history of people that have basically given up the left-wing project and have just resigned themselves to whatever is. And this kind of creates this moodiness, this energy, which people, when you come out of that and you say that you're anti-capitalist, or that you have all these people that, you have these politicians that are they were going to have a wealth and prosperity and growth and abundance, and you are just a pissy little You don't want people to be happy. You don't want people to be successful. You don't want people to be wealthy. You just want to be a little bitch. And you just want to cry about everything. This is what it feels like trying to be a leftist, basically, right? Is that, no, like the whole point is you don't want to make it into this thing where capitalism means wealth, success, prosperity, happiness, and to be anti-capitalist means that you just cry about things and you don't get what you want and you pout and whatever, right? Like this is the whole point, is that to be anti-capitalist is basically, in this sense, is that we have wealth and we have resources, and that you can profit and you can grow without, there's something about, by, if you define capitalism as just growth and profit and wealth and abundance, you miss the fact that when you have all these stores going out of business, and when you have just empty storefronts, and that when you have people have, when you have grocery stores that can't find people to work low-level jobs, so you have to have migrant workers who are not even in the same economic strata as what's supposed to be your average citizen. You have to start creating an underclass of what feels like slave labor to work these jobs, because otherwise you're just like, well, we could just also just, well, why don't we just liquidate all of our grocery stores and just have like some sort of like elite Costco service where you have, you just show up to a big warehouse and they just, you don't need, the whole premise of going to a grocery store and talking to the guy at the deli counter, old-fashioned. We don't need that anymore. We're just going to have delivery trucks straight to your door, and you never go to a store again. And we're just going to take the construction crews, demolish all the old grocery stores, and build high-rise, high-density housing complexes to support all the people that are getting dislocated from climate change. And then there will be the growth of the economy. Our economy is going to fucking skyrocket. We'll do great, right? So at that kind of there's a change that could happen, right? There's a change that could happen that could be emancipatory, that could, like, this is the whole thing. My politics is, there's a lot of, this is the whole thing. I grew up exposure. There's this kind of problem where I don't want to get into it. The thing about people not liking migrants or stuff like that. The thing is, if you allow more immigration, it's actually good for growth, because then you have more consumers to buy products from your business. And then it's actually good for growth for those people to have enough money to buy the products and be part of the economy, right? The more that you keep these people as a kind of a slave class of people that don't have the same rights and freedoms as you do, and that these people you're exploiting them because you don't want to work at whatever Tim Hortons or at the grocery stores. You have to have a bunch of slave people to work that job. And that nobody can work that job and afford to pay rent and then do all this stuff. It's not a sustainable system to do it like that. It's all going to fuck up. It's all going to collapse. We can adapt in certain ways. But the thing is, it's like, what I'm trying to say is that this system of extraction, basically, you have people sucking the vital blood. It's like vampire capitalism. You have these rich vampires who are sucking the vital energy out of what makes things good. And then when too much of that happens, they become these shitty products that nobody wants. And then you just have to be like, liquidation world, everybody. We're just going to liquidate all this bullshit, and you can just buy it for cheap. And then we're going to blow it all up and bulldoze everything. And then we're going to build a fucking massive high rise. All the NIMBYs aren't going to like it, right? And then we're gonna have full of immigrants, and then nobody's gonna like that, But sorry, that's capitalism too, right? But you can't just be like, oh, capitalism is just me growing and being wealthy and successful. It's not all the stuff I don't like. Yeah, the bad stuff is also capitalism. Sorry to break it for you, right? And that even this whole "Make America Great Again," this fear of this is the funniest thing about that like Donald Trump is actually ironically kind of like anti-capitalist, but trying to like keep the image of being like, I'm a businessman. How can you be a businessman and be anti-capitalist, right? But this is essentially, the people don't know how to express anti-capitalism, so they're doing it in the most fucking dumbass, convoluted way possible, right? And so it was this climate that makes me think, well, if this is how people are reacting, and I've seen these people, these activists, dedicate themselves to these pointless battles that they only lose. And, I don't want to fall into that trap of just being cynical and pessimistic and bitter and not enjoying life, So instead, I'm trying to strike a happy medium of trying to occupy the format of doing astrology, but then saying, like, why can't you have Uranus? So what's Uranus, right? Well, how do you bring Uranus back into this? You have a certain amount of wealth that you have raw materials, and you have factories, and you have industry as an asset, right? Do you see what I'm saying? That there is the generation of technological assets, of technological infrastructure, of this build baby build at the material level. Is it like this whole stuff that's happening is a movement of this Uranus and Taurus to do with our resources, our assets, and how the thing about the freedom and the emancipation is that at first what happens is that it's not very freeing or emancipating at all. You have all these people working basically like having no 9 to 5 overtime, labor protections, you have child labor, all this kind of stuff. That had to be fought for. You had to rebel against the conditions of your exploitation and your oppressions to have these basic rights for the worker, right? And that is a natural part of, so you have one kind of change and you have another kind of change that naturally results and unfolds from that, right? And that you have all these things that come part and parcel together, and that what we as astrologers, we have this gift that instead we have an enormously complex idea that we can use the symbol of Uranus as shorthand for, right? Which is not just, it becomes both the before you had a system of hierarchical control, where you had an inherent class of the rulers and the workers, right? And that the emancipation, after you had the technological breakthrough, then you had the emancipation of the worker, the civil rights movement as a natural consequence, historical inevitability leading up from that, right? And basically, so there's some sort of potential. I feel like if you're not tapping into this, looking at what's happening in the astrology today, seeing the life of the archetype expressing itself in the current events, there's some, I don't know. I'm at least, for me, there seems to be, there's a way I can approach it from this angle and retain some enthusiasm, and just, rather than narrowing it down to this win or lose game where you're just like, oh, I'm gonna have to be an activist and bash my head against the wall against some fucking thing that never, that never changes, right? I'm approaching it. I'm trying to, incorporate these dynamics into my astrology, but I have to also admit that there's some basic problem about whatever, mass media and populism, the democratization of the media, right? The democratization of the media. Think about that one for a minute. Imagine what it would be like, the printing press, the distribution of ideas, and all this kind of stuff it's this clash where there is the access to information that disrupts the status hierarchy, right? Because before you had a intellectual class of scholars and elites that were the privileged people that could only access the ability to think about things, and then you had a bunch of just obedient worker class, right? But now if the obedient worker class have the ability what capitalism promises, the American dream promises, is a egalitarian society where there isn't just a set group of people who are the rulers is that anybody who has an idea for a business, who can seize the economic opportunity, can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and and take advantage of what's happening, and that this is supposed to mean it's an even playing field for everyone, right? But we're not quite there yet, obviously. What we tend to see is that people that come from a line of a lineage of power use their existing wealth as this substrate to be like your assets that are going to be your leverage. That if you take a risk, you take a gamble, and you take the hit, you have assets to leverage. You have something to fall back on. Where if the bank needs to seize your land, you've got land for them to seize, right? If you don't have that, you don't have anything to get your foot in the door with. You know what I'm saying? And this is basically there's all this controversy right now where people are really we've got like. I'm a Canadian, and there's all this stuff about Indigenous politics and land back, and they're even awarding certain First Nation groups land and all this kind of stuff. It's a big point of controversy, right? I don't know. I don't know if this is what my audience wants to see, by the way. I also have to admit that when I am looking at which of my videos perform the best, when it comes to stuff with Venus or whatever, right? Like one of the videos that I did that performed particularly well, I was talking about like a couple that got caught on the Coldplay Jumbotron, but then there was a controversy because it was like the guy was somebody's boss, and like talking about like the couple getting caught on the Coldplay Jumbotron tends to get me a lot of likes on YouTube. I don't know if me trying to explain capitalism and economics and all this stuff is going to be the kind of thing that gets me like consumer success for my astrology channel. And so in this kind of idea, though, there's this kind of like, there's this pressure on me to try to problem solve my content or whatever my project is in such a way that grants me like material success, right? Or like this idea that like I have to make my little endeavor here something that makes more money for me so I can accumulate wealth off of it. Otherwise, what's the point, right? And that there's that people dealing with those kinds of problems end up calling that problem capitalism, right? And it's not just like, obviously not just this, could be anything, right? Any kind of thing that I would do as like a hobby or something for fun. There could be like this pressure. Could you monetize your hobbies? Could you turn this into a business? Could you make money off of it? And people call this capitalism, right? But the thing about this is that, is this capitalism? Why is that called capitalism, right? The point about it is that when you think about hobbies or I'm thinking there's where I'm getting at here is that with the Uranus archetype, there's also this element of freedom, right? When you're working for a boss, the boss has a number of jobs for you to do, and you have to just do the work that is doled out to you from your boss, right? It's not up to you to decide what job you want to do, right? Now, the thing about trying to monetize your hobbies is that the hobby tends to be something that in your time off from your job that you elect to do something out of your own free will. This is something that interests me, that I have fun doing, that I just gravitate towards, or that I want to do out of my own volition, and then without having a boss telling me to do this, right? Now, the thing about this is that what if instead of a society that's hierarchically built where everybody has a boss telling them what they need to do, that everybody instead has their own free will to determine what it is they want to do, right? What job they like, and whether or not, so instead of seeing your life as maybe you were born to a family of like really successful lawyers, and that the amount of money that you can make being a successful lawyer is way more than a lot of other things. So you're under pressure to, keep this family lineage up of this kind of career or whatever. But then you have a hobby where you really like this other thing, right? There's this kind of, the freedom is that you are not beholden to your even if your family is really successful, you could have the freedom to do something entirely different, just something that you like to do, and not have some like a boss or a father figure or something like that dictate to you what it is you do with your life, right? But then in the absence of that, a dictator, a king, an authority figure, a father figure, our lineage, you are a member of our family, you must do what our family has always done, you have to carry out this tradition. Instead, you have the freedom to choose for yourself to take a different path, right? But the thing is, in the absence of there being this command that you have to do this thing, what you then have is the pressure to be able to make money. And that the pressure to make money in some way before you had the idea of the king was this kind of totalizing force that whatever happened, if there was some law or some sort of thing, the king could forgive you, the king could overturn a law, the king could make an exception to the rule or something. Now we're losing that idea of like an authority figure who has some kind of sovereignty, and instead what we have is an oligarchy, which is a rule by the rich and powerful, and that there is the force of money and wealth and power as something that does not, it's not like having a person that's there who has a distinct will that tells you to do something, but every time you're doing something that's not profitable for you, there's some kind of sense that you are going against the grain of this, what we call capitalism, right? Which is, there's something about this which doesn't make sense to me, because isn't it precisely the idea that why we like hobbies is because it liberates us from the what makes one thing, why there's all this pressure to keep the family lineage is because if you have a father that's a lawyer or a dentist or all this kind of stuff and they want you to keep doing it, then you are keeping up this thing that makes a lot of money, and that there could be this other thing that's fun but it doesn't make a lot of money, right? And there's this kind of thing where you're like, well, what if you take this thing that is fun but doesn't make a lot of money, but you find a way to get a lot of money out of it anyways, right? Why not? This is the thing about capitalism, is that capitalism, there's no real limit to what you can make money off of versus what you can't make money off of. And the problem about capitalism is that in the absence of this sort of paternalistic father figure who just wants to keep you on track doing one thing, and that it just so happens that because that this thing is a reliable way to make money or something like that, there's this temptation that with capitalism that anything could be a way to make money if just so much as you are inventive with it, right? But then there's this kind of thing is like, is that freedom, right? Because then it starts to be like, well, then if I can apply that principle where I can make money off of everything, then there's this yin yang thing that happens where instead of being free, now you're bound to doing something only in the way that makes money for you, right? And that there could be all these other ways that may not, all these other options that are then omitted and it's not because there is a king or a ruler that has like this like you must do this because it's God's decree. It's simply because you like the bottom line is the dollar sign, right? And there is also I think there are certain other things that play too, because you also need to have a certain amount of wealth and resources in the first place to give yourself enough, I don't know, like you need to have the free time to have enough time and energy to invest yourself into a project, and that if it's not returning on your money, then you're not, there isn't like this mounting pressure to make money some other way if the thing that you're doing that doesn't make money for you makes money for you, right? And there's something. What am I trying to say here is that I think there's a risk about turning this sort of pervasive need for profit or to make something financially valid, like a financially valid endeavor. We take that and we call that capitalism. But so what if capitalism isn't that, but capitalism is basically a process of looking at imbalances between assets and resources, and it's not about, what am I trying to say? Is that to be anti-capitalistic isn't about wanting scarcity for everybody, but rather that we can't, what am I trying to say? We can't let capitalism just only be associated with growth and profit and prosperity, and then when there's a big crash, that's just something else. That's just, well, I don't know what the crash is. It's not capitalism is just when things are going well. When a crash happens, that's called depression. It's not, the depression isn't part of capitalism. That's something completely different, right? And that, or that to be, I don't want to call myself an anti-capitalist and have people interpret that as me just being, I'm just a grumpy old fuddy-duddy who doesn't want to be successful, who doesn't want to make money, who doesn't want anybody to be happy, who basically wants everybody to be poor and who wants everybody to suffer. Like, because this is what it feels like to occupy that space, to be like, hey guys, I like astrology, but I also don't like the pressure. Like, what the whole thing is like, like there's some kind of thing where it's like, instead of having a authority figure telling me what I have to do, I have this vague pressure that I need to validate what I do by making money off of it. And in order to do that, I have to, rather than just sort of leisurely, working at my own pace, I have to make myself really fucking busy. Because when apparently this study came out that said adolescence lasts actually to your 30s. So that it's not just when you're a child or a teenager, but when you are a young person and you have to put up with these stupid fucking these jobs where if you're not working, you have to, if there's nothing to do, you can't just sit around the clock. Or you actually have to like look busy, or you have to be this thing. I'm going to spend 8 hours a day in where I have to be in a state of constant hyper agitation. Oh my God. It's like you're just like, why? Like you're taking somebody and conditioning to them that you're like, for 8 hours a day, you cannot rest. You cannot just be at peace. You have to be constantly alert. You have to be constantly looking over your shoulder. If your boss is there, you have to be constantly looking around for something to do. You can't just chill. You have to always be doing something, right? And then if you are now that if you have free time, you have to apply that same mentality, and that if you are really busy, and then in a way where that money isn't coming in, something's wrong. Oh my God! Now you spend this. Now you have all this too much energy, and now because you're gonna invest all that into problem solving why the money isn't coming in, and you're gonna spend instead of just chilling out, you're gonna spend 8 hours a day just hyper focusing. How do we make more money? How do I just and then all of this is to cover up for the fact that really you just want to be validated and accepted, right? There's an absence of an authority figure that says, I can see you're doing the best you can. I can see you're trying really hard. I think you have, a talent in this area. Instead of having a actual relationship with actual people, we just have this pressure that if the dollars are coming in, then I can be happy. If they're not, then I'm doing something wrong. And we call that capitalism, right? And now it's really interesting because we're in a situation where if we're being told by the president of the United States that we can't even talk about this or else we're dangerous, right? And so I'm at least, taking the opportunity to not be repressed about this and vocalize and express my position on it in a somewhat rebellious way, going against the grain of what's normal and accepted. And the problem is that if I just have this problem, like I don't think I have it in me to just drop the astrology channel and just try to do a straight political thing because it just looks too bleak to me, right? And there's something about, it's like, I don't know, there's something about spirituality where there's a transcendent like source of energy and enthusiasm where it's not all just, you're reduced to a material world where you gain and lose, or you have victories or you have losses, and you're just like, you're just flattened out. Like that's the only position you have, right? There's some sort of like, having a bit of transcendence. It's not, you can have the transcendence give you a bit of extra motivation to approach these problems rather than just being a total escape from them, basically, right? And I think that there's there's also this crossover between a political emancipation and spiritual liberation. It's only the problem that historically the spiritual liberation was bound up in a Brahmin kind of class, right? The project of emancipation for all, a truly egalitarian society. This is the dream of the Uranus archetype. In astrology, we consider this to be something in the heavens that we struggle to bring to Earth in its perfect manifestation, right? And astrology is a way to sort of put that in the mandala, right? It's not something, it's like the struggle for emancipation, freedom, liberation, release from these old pressures. That's what Uranus, I think, really stands for in its highest. Thanks for watching.